Indie Sleaze is the name for an aesthetic that was popular from 2006 to around 2012, and several sources say that it was in vogue all the way up to 2014. It was heavily inspired by indie musicians, primarily rock and pop acts, from singers to DJs alike. This is an aesthetic in which there's such a heavy overlap not just between lifestyle and fashion, but music and fashion, because music is a large part of the lifestyle. Because so many of these artists were independent, they were used to writing and producing music themselves, piecing it from the ground up with whatever funds and means are available to them, which you can also see echoed in the fashion. It's clear a lot of these looks are the product of years of finding that right vintage piece that matches that sweater you borrowed from a friend and meant to give back, but y'all don't talk anymore. It's very mix and match, so the price of the pieces or where they're from doesn't necessarily matter as much as the statement that they make. Like some of these looks, you could reasonably buy the exact pieces worn at the mall, though obviously there is some design or some vintage that can be incorporated. And though it can be dark and often is, Indie Sleaze is not an understated look by any means, but it is effortless. Indie Sleaze doesn't work if it looks like you're wearing a costume, no matter how neon the colors, how furry the vest, or how ripped the tights. It's meant to look very on purpose, yet very matter-of-fact at the same time. Most of all, the outfit is not an appeal for others to see you as fashionable because that validation isn't needed. Yet it's communicated that you know how to create a look, or better yet, a statement. Similar to a lot of the modernized electronic and dance music popular at the time, Indie Sleaze takes a lot of fashion inspiration from past decades. This is why you see a lot of intricate prints, patterns, vests, and furs, which for example take a lot of inspiration for the 70s. Also interesting overlap because Indie Sleaze incorporates a lot of 90s fashion and a lot of 70s fashion had a resurgence in the 90s. Converse, for example, were popular in both the 70s and the 90s and can be seen in a lot of Indie Sleaze looks, though I do think you could argue that they're a shoe that never really goes out of style. Indie Sleaze also has a lot of grunge influence, and I even saw it referred to as the more boho version of grunge. It also makes sense that a fashion movement in which thrifting is popular would lead to older trends reemerging because often you find a lot of older items when thrifting. This interest in vintage items even extended to vintage technology, with things like typewriters and disposable cameras becoming popular again as a nod to past eras of art and intellectualism with which the youth often love to identify. Brands like American Apparel were at their height during this period, and popular items like their disco pant or their skater skirts point to this retro influence. Several of their adverts make direct influence to Indie Sleaze photography. The pictures are raunchy, the lighting isn't perfect because it's flash photography, though obviously these are for a campaign. But most importantly, they look candid, which also shows how the clothes really move. Photography is an integral part of Indie Sleaze, maybe even one of the most integral parts, because it was these photos that helped popularize the aesthetic. A lot of credit is given to Mark Hunter, also known as the Cobra Snake, who captured various young musicians and socialites indulging in nightlife. Most of these photos are dark because they were taken at some sort of club or venue, with the subject being illuminated by the flash and maybe a piece of neon clothing here or a sequin there. These photos have a candid aspect to them, showing the subject enjoying the event that they're at or at least participating in it, to the point where oftentimes you can actually question whether they know the photo is being taken. Because these pictures were taken on real nights out, the Cobra Snake subjects vary from Steve Aoki to Lindsay Lohan to Tabby Gevinson. And because the subjects are living in the moment, these photos have the quality of making the event look like something you'd actually be sad to miss. There's probably also a candid aspect to them because the person in the photo might be a little drunk or a little high, meaning looking perfect for a photo can be a little hard to do. I read an interesting Racked LA article for this video called Before They Were Stars, They Partied in LA, which covers a lot of musicians known on the LA party scene before they were household names. The article includes a quote from the Cobra Snake saying, "Hollywood was a different place in 2006. Parties were real and raw. Everyone was there to have fun and enjoy the music. Social media and smartphones weren't a thing yet, so people could live in the moment and I could capture them." And to bring things full circle, since a lot of these photos were taken at clubs, parties, other social events, music was undoubtedly a large part of them. Artists like MGMT, Sky Ferreira, MIA, Steve Aoki again, the Arctic Monkeys, Phoenix, Santigold, so many others contributed to the music scene, which was often about being young, irreverent, and viewing partying as this almost holy thing. A lot of young people were flocking to clubs or house parties because it was a relatively cheap way to make fun, make friends, and be seen. Additionally, the club was a way to forget financial troubles and life's responsibilities, which often overlap. 2008 to 2012, which are said to be the peak Indie Sleaze years, they also coincide with the Great Recession and their after effects. Because of this, aesthetics like McBling that were all about conspicuously expensive clothing, being flashy, and even vapid to an extent, they were beginning to fall out of fashion. And I think it's pretty inarguable the recession's influence also had an effect in the somewhat DIY philosophy of the Indie Sleaze look. That, and it was spearheaded by young kids who didn't have a lot of money or didn't want to make it obvious that they or their family did because that wasn't as fashionable anymore. But still, certain pieces or accessories could be indicators of wealth. They just might not be so obvious or conspicuous as, say, a Louis Vuitton duffel bag or a Juicy Couture tracksuit. And for example, I wouldn't consider American Apparel to be a brand that's necessarily cheap, but just by looking at the garments, you can't always tell. For example, in 2013, I think I paid about $40 for a pair of black American Apparel jelly sandals, and then maybe a week later went to the beauty store and found another pair that looked the same and clear and bought those for like $10, so a lesson was learned. I feel like there's also this aspect of nihilism, even cynicism to indie sleaze. As much as a lot of the scene exalted art, music, creation, and even celebrity to an extent, a lot of the negative aspects of that lifestyle, like substance abuse, mental health struggles, and EDs were in the spotlight as well. Tripping out of bars or being so lit you could barely open your eyes, as long as aesthetically pleasing photos came from it, it was viewed as not just expected behavior from young people, but iconic behavior. At most, these photos, no matter how frequent they were a sign that you were a good time and were desired socially and nothing more, a conclusion often drawn by young fans not only looking at these photos, but wanting to emulate them. It seemed almost cool to be misunderstood or struggling, and what was the point of breaking out of the scene if it seemed like the recession had ripped away the promise of a comfortable traditional life if one just worked hard enough? Santigo's disparate youth captures this well with lyrics like, "So let them say we can do better. Lay out the rules that we can't break. They want to sit and watch you wither. Their legacy's too hard to take." And then in some ways, this sort of messy hedonism being stylish now probably just made more people comfortable and engaging in it, even if they never really had to depend on working. Indie sleaze became popular amongst the youth not just from being spread from club to club or concert to concert, but social media also played a large role. Sites like MySpace and Tumblr were perfect mood boards precisely because they were able to incorporate music, art, and fashion with that social aspect of posts and comments, so you can really see the whole lifestyle of the aesthetic. MySpace allowed people to share music with their friends from the moment they landed on their page, as well as photos, and curate their pages to their own unique tastes. Like, in a lot of ways, social media back then was even more personalized than it is today, or I would say you had more control over your social media presence or your page. Likewise, bands and musicians could use social media to promote their music, and many often did. Tumblr also played a role, as several pictures and pop shots from hedonistic parties and lyrics by indie artists of all kinds were worked and reworked into pictures for users to reblog, almost like a daily horoscope. You couldn't scroll for a couple minutes without seeing a screen grab from Skins, a show that perfectly captures the teenage side of indie sleaze, a lot of the larger-than-life parties, but a lot of the dangerous results. I would also maybe throw Facebook into the ring too when it comes to social media. I was not clubbing back in like 2009, obviously, because I was a middle schooler, but I had a digital camera and some friends, so like sleepovers, games, field trips, last days of school, best believe a bunch of photos were going to be taken. And back then, it was common to just upload whatever photos got taken at said event to an album, so now you've got 40 photos in an album called Last Night XD. You didn't take the time to edit every photo or even pick out the best ones. If the photo was taken, it was in the album. And this was not just a middle school thing. You can still find a lot of albums on people's Facebook profiles that have like every angle of an event and dozens of very in-the-moment photos.
What's the matter?
Just hay fever.
And actually social media, well, how it's changed over time, is said to be part of the reason that indie sleaze went out of fashion. Aside from being more removed from the effects of the recession with time, the rise of social media sites like Instagram led to social media posts being more curated. It's likely because back then you only had one photo to post on Instagram, so make it count. Unless you want to flood your grid and post a bunch more. I think Instagram was initially supposed to be like an, oh, just take a snap in the moment thing, which it was for a little while before things became so curated. And let's be real, the fake off-guard, spontaneous, in the moment thing was so real. All your off-guard photos, you knew exactly where the camera was. No longer was it okay to just look human, but instead like the most perfect, uncanny version of yourself, because why would you want to show anything but perfection to your friends or whoever else happened upon your profile? It seems more common in a lot of social media posts from this time that the subject is very aware of the photos being taken, and often it's a selfie that they're taking, so you get the sense that these pictures are for social media rather than pictures that ended up on social media. I would also think that this wasn't just influenced by a lot of social media apps making it more difficult to batch post photos, but also this change of social media being centered around people we actually knew to feeling like you have to cater to the whole world in a sense, because if anyone can see what you post, that might press you to want to look more perfect, on trend, and show a lifestyle that really reflects that. And honestly, a lot of that was fed to us by celebrities and socialites like the Kardashians, who kind of revitalized this larger-than-life, very conspicuous form of celebrity, who primarily sold a look or a lifestyle rather than the many products they were known to endorse. With time, once again, the rich kids were more okay with looking like rich kids again, whether that was showing off a lot's worth of candy-painted cars in your driveway or a stack of Cartier love bracelets that cost more than someone's tuition. So about a decade after Indie Sleaze first fell out of fashion, the aesthetic gained renewed interest online. Primarily, a lot of the interest came from members of Gen Z who, like myself, were very aware of this aesthetic and lifestyle even when it was first popular, maybe participated in some of the fashion trends, but were a bit too young to live it up fully. And in addition to that, some younger Gen Z are probably encountering it for the first time, and then it's likely quite a few millennials who lived through it were reminiscing, maybe even bragging, which, you know what, fine, because they knew what time was back then, and were like, yeah, it was fun, sorry y'all missed out. The renewed interest in this aesthetic is also what earned it its name, popularized by trend forecaster Mandy Lee in late 2021. Back in October of 2021, one of her trend predictions for 2022 was that Indie Sleaze would come back into fashion, especially after people moved on from reviving Y2K McBling.
If you read Megan Fox's nonsensical Instagram caption, it reads like it was straight from a Tumblr quote. Also, the rise in outdated technology. Back then it was typewriters and Polaroid. This time around it's wired headphones and phone cases that mimic outdated technology. Mashups were really huge during Indie Sleaze, and TikTok has single-handedly brought back mashups into mainstream culture.
And since then, we have seen several examples to prove her right. In terms of fashion, it seems a more layered mix and match approach is returning in place of a lot of those clean, minimal lines that were popular for years. I think we're seeing a lot of looks that have more visual weight to them, as well as statement pieces meant to add a bit of whimsy and individuality to your look, as a kind of way to show that you might be aware of the trends, but don't feel the need to copy them one-to-one. For a lot of people, there seems to be this yearning to express their individuality, which is normal, but probably has been exacerbated by years of the social media hive mind. In addition, even the way that we shop or find clothes that we want to wear, I think has changed over time somewhat too. Like, I would go out on a limb and say that it's less likely now that when people buy new clothing items, it's just something that they stumbled upon in person or something they flipped across in a magazine and they likely saw it online, social media, something like that. Not always, but pretty often. Even thrifting is a completely different world than a decade ago, surely way different from the early 2000s, with a lot of fast fashion being sent directly there or becoming common for sellers to hunt for the good items and then mark them up for way more than they may have cost in the first place. Musically, we have a few examples of albums that seem to be leaning into that Indie Sleaze resurgence also. One example I think is Slater's Starfucker, which came out in September of 2023. In my opinion, the most Indie Sleaze song on that album is undoubtedly I Love Hollywood, which is this dark synth pop song about partying and debauchery. The song makes overt reference to substance abuse that was framed in a more glamorous way, irresponsible spending, all tied together by the pre-chorus, I wanna die at the chateau, I'm gonna take you tonight, no cigarettes in my hotel, unless you're being polite. There's even a direct reference to Terry Richardson in the song, a famous photographer of the Indie Sleaze era before his sexual misconduct allegations came to light. And even within the song, there seems to be the sense of it having been a known thing before it was made public, as is often the case based on the lyric, Terry Richardson just called me up, that freak is taking my pick tonight. Production-wise, the song has that dark punchiness you'd expect of a club song, begging you to power on, even if you've lost a grasp on all your senses. It's unrelenting, and the chorus, I Love Hollywood, sounds so sarcastic after being wedged between lyrics about recklessness and debauchery, but the love in question is love of the freeness, the ego boost of even being considered as somebody. Also, when we think Hollywood, we think movies, red carpets, A-list premieres, but this dark, grimy underbelly is as equally a part of it. And of course, we've got to talk about Brat. This is the album quite a lot of the new Indie Sleaze discourse has revolved around. Charli's no stranger to it, having grown up on the rave scene, and was making a bigger name for herself as an artist right on the tail end of that first Indie Sleaze wave. And with Brat, Charli has been credited as helping bring Indie Sleaze back into full force with her celebration of nightlife and that cool, unbothered it-girl attitude encapsulated by the album's title, Brat. Songs like 360, Mean Girls, Von Dutch, and 365 directly references club life, up till morning, substances abound, your favorite party people at your side. That city sells, that's the vibe internationally recognized. Similarly, for all the celebrations of partying, there are points on Brat that express that loneliness, that feeling of being misunderstood or outcast, like I might say something stupid or sympathy is a knife. And production-wise, Charli draws on a lot of that synthy pop, rock influences, and electroclash present at the height of Indie Sleaze, really pays homage to a lot of the inspiration for the album. I even saw publications like Sourcing Journal claim Charli XCX might be the one who officially toppled the clean girl aesthetic and is leading a wave of youths to fully lean into the grime and perfect imperfection of indie sleaze. They note, millennials reminisce on the 2010s club culture that Charli XCX is reviving in this hyperpop album and reclaiming their youth, which many had taken away during the pandemic years as nightlife shut down. In contrast, the album speaks to Gen Z's new experiences of partying and discovering nostalgic styles such as indie sleaze for the first time. Speaking of, he's technically a millennial, but born in 96, so likely not clubbing in the 2000s or early 2010s, but the Dare is a producer that many have also put at the forefront of this indie sleaze revival. He actually produced Guess, both the original and the remix for Charli XCX. Girls, another hit of his, I think has that very indie sleaze, ogling, debauched tinge to it.
I like the girls that do drugs, girls with cigarettes in the back of the club.
When I first heard it, I was immediately reminded of 303 and Peaches. The Guardian also named the Dare as the poster boy for the new indie sleaze movement, and while speaking to them, he described his music as a drunk punch to the face, which I think says it all. He says he's aware that he's drawing on a lot of musical inspiration from sources who weren't necessarily mainstream, so that could put a similar limit on his career. But I also think that's not necessarily bad because a lot of these artists not only have a cult following, but had a clear vision and style, which is why they were so loved and are so remembered. Another piece of evidence used to back the indie sleaze reemergence, one that somehow went right over my head, is Saltburn, primarily the aesthetics and setting, not necessarily the plot. For one, the movie takes place in 2006, and because of this, we have MGMT's Time to Pretend featured in the movie.
Get jobs in offices and wake up for the morning.
In Saltburn, even though the students attend Oxford and many of them are wealthy, we still see a lot of casual pieces mixed in with designer ones, showing that mix of wealth but also rejection of it in favor of what's cool. The character Venetia represents this well. She of course comes from generational wealth, but pluck her out of the context of her family and you might hardly be able to tell with her grown-out roots and mix and match wardrobe with clashing but eye-catching pieces. Despite usually seeing her in daytime scenes, there's always this sense of this is an outfit from last night, emphasized by the smudged eye makeup and the sweaters thrown atop of whatever she's wearing. It's not chic, but it somehow is chic because it again gives off that I don't have anything to prove, I don't have to prove my family's wealth vibe, which, you kind of don't have to when you're sitting in a mansion. She's not exactly wearing the disco pant, but this jumpsuit, it very much has that indie sleaze disco vibe to it. And since I pointed out that indie sleaze was a relatively new term, I was curious to know if the indie sleaze aesthetic even had a name back then, because sometimes it is hard to name or describe something when you're right in it, but according to Spin Magazine, blog rock was one of the terms used at the time. Also, according to them, the term indie sleaze actually came from a girl named Olivia who runs a popular indie sleaze Instagram account, and she told them about the term. I saw a Reddit comment describing the photography of the hipster era as sleazy, which I thought was very apt. Sleaze worked better than some of the other words I was playing with. The word sleaze also comes up on Uffie's Art of Uff and mags such as Sleaze Nation that featured artists like Peaches and Fisher Spooner. Olivia was of the opinion that aside from being on time with the trend cycles, it made sense for indie sleaze to reemerge as a response to collective trauma that a lot of youths, and honestly the world, experienced in the early 2020s, obviously referencing things like the pandemic and outrageous inflation. So a lot of that cynicism and nihilism that existed for millennials back then, many Gen Z can definitely relate. Olivia also notes that aside from the recession, which didn't happen in the midst of indie sleaze having already taken off, that it was also likely somewhat a response to 9/11. She claimed, I feel like that was the catalyst for how this entire subculture was born because people were feeling this existential loss. It also makes sense that we're looking back on indie sleaze fondly now, or even with jealousy, because partying and seeing friends was such a large part of it, and a lot of us had that taken away from us for a couple of years because of lockdown. People have been open about feeling the after effects of that or still feeling socially stunted. Far Out Magazine has an interesting perspective on the indie sleaze resurgence. They note, interestingly, the resurgence of indie sleaze culture sonically has been primarily limited to audience re-interest in the initial wave. Few artists and alternative scenes are trying to emulate the dance-infused guitar sound and indulgent lyricism of the early 2000s. Perhaps the most prevalent contemporary artist to do so is electroclash act The Dare, whose self-titled EP featured the hit single Girls. Because of this, Far Out notes the indie sleaze resurgence may potentially be short-lived, since most of the new contributions or contributions to its revival are referencing the past rather than pushing the needle forward. And this article was written in July of 2023, so it was before the release of things like Brat or Saltburn, so I'm not sure if that would have changed their perspective, but to be fair, these projects came out less than a year after this article was written, so maybe they don't necessarily nullify the prediction that indie sleaze may not be here to stay for a while. I think Kesha is an example of one of those artists who fits that initial wave of indie sleaze that Far Out is talking about. She was obviously extremely popular back then for her party-ready pop, and her look, especially back then, was one that fit indie sleaze to a T. Recently, with the release of Joyride especially, I've seen a lot of people say, yeah, old Kesha is back. Even when talking about it, I said that Joyride felt connected to Kesha's earliest work, but not like a regurgitation of it. But Joyride is similarly weird, colorful, in your face, and irreverent. It's also interesting that this indie sleaze revival is happening parallel to a revival of sorts in Kesha's career, since Joyride is her first independent release. I remember mentioning this in a video before, but it's pretty much impossible to completely revive an aesthetic, trend, or movement in the way it used to exist, because we'll always be viewing it or participating in it from the lens of the present. So at best, the indie sleaze resurgence can only ever be a 2020s take on the 2000s or 2010s. I think another really good tangible example of this is the new Razr phone. It's obviously been re-released or revamped to capitalize on the nostalgia, and actually is an example of a phone popular during indie sleaze years. But of course, this new Razr is touchscreen, has access to the internet, things of the like, so while it's reminiscent of the time when phones actually had some character and personality, it's not a direct copy or re-release of the old Razr. And phones, how they have changed over time, it's such an interesting part of this because they play such a large role in social media. Smartphones have equipped us all with not just a mobile camera, but a direct line to millions of people who can see whatever content you take on that phone if you share it. That, for one, is a reason that I think it's unlikely club culture, even parties sometimes, will get as outlandish as they used to, at least not across the board. But people dying to abandon their smartphones or even have something reminiscent of these pre-smartphone days, I think it expresses a yearning for a life before social media was this dark cloud looming over a lot of people's heads, and before everything seemed so overly curated, or curated with such an awareness of an audience, I should say. The indie sleaze era was in no way this non-judgmental, everyone's beautiful utopia, but I think it's easy to have a grass is greener mentality, especially when a lot of things that last from an era, so to speak, are the more aesthetically pleasing, attractive parts of it. But like I said, a lot of indie sleaze included a lot of glamorizing, sometimes romanticizing substance abuse, EDs, mental illness, unhealthy living, and it seems like for years we've tried to combat that, especially as social media exacerbated this pressure to always look insta-ready. And so maybe not individually, and we're still not a perfect society, but I do think a lot of our mindsets have changed on several things. Like for example, can indie sleaze really come back in a world where people lose their minds over their fave being popped with a cigarette in their hand? Like, in my opinion, it just can't. And then lastly, aside from pointing out it being pretty hard, pretty impossible to recreate an aesthetic or movement because with time, fashion changes, technology changes, I think it's been hard for Gen Z to create these eras or even revive past ones because we're so hyper aware of it. A little off topic, but I do think it ties the point of this video together well. I've been thinking for a while, and maybe 10 years or something like that, it might even be possible that these past 5 years or so far, of being so backward looking and past obsessed, more so than we've been in the recent past, that might become an aesthetic or era on its own. I'm not sure what the name of it would be or what would typify it, but that's the point, because no one was sitting around in 2008 getting ready for the club and was like, do you think this outfit gives indie sleaze? I can't make the point that it's kind of impossible to directly recreate the past without it being shaped by your present lens, and then say all we did in the early 2020s was recycle the old stuff with no changes, no infusions, no additions. It's just hard to see it when you're in it, and we might have a better perspective or even a name for this period when we're further removed. As always, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe so that you can stick around for more. And if you'd like to become a channel member and get early access to videos, the link is in the description. Again, thank you so much for watching. I love you all so very much, and we'll see you so very soon. Bye-bye.